Nobody at Hartwell Animal Rescue wanted to go near cage number 14. Not because the cat inside was vicious, not because it had ever drawn blood or lunged at anyone who passed. It had never done any of those things. But there was something about the way it moved, or rather, the way it refused to move, that made every person who approached that particular row of kennels feel as though they were intruding on something private, something guarded. The gray tabby inside, a male roughly 4 years old, with a thin white stripe running between his eyes, would press himself into the back left corner and go completely still the moment footsteps came near. He didn't hiss right away. He didn't need to. The stillness itself was a warning. What made the volunteers uneasy wasn't the silence. It was what the silence was protecting. Every single time anyone looked through the wire mesh of cage 14, they could see it some small, shapeless thing tucked beneath the cat's body, hidden under the curve of his belly and his folded front paws. Nobody knew exactly what it was. The bedding around it had been arranged, not randomly kicked aside the way cats often do, but deliberately positioned, like a nest built with intention. The gray tabby lay on top of whatever it was with the kind of focused, deliberate weight that a person might use to shield something fragile from a crowd. The staff had a word for it. They called him resource guarding, which in the language of animal shelters carried a specific weight. It meant unpredictable. It meant liability. It meant the paperwork attached to his kennel card listed behavioral concerns in red ink, and that prospective adopters who wandered down that row and asked about him were gently steered toward other animals before they got close enough to notice the stiffening in his posture. The name on his card read Oliver. Someone had written it in blue marker, neat and careful, like the name deserved to be treated gently, even if the animal was considered difficult. Families came through Hartwell every weekend. They moved down the aisles with the bright, restless energy of people hoping to fall in love. Children pressed their fingers through the mesh, adults crouched, and made soft clicking sounds. Cage after cage produced responses, a paw extended, a slow blink, a rumbling purr offered up like a gift. At cage 14, the response was always the same. Oliver would shift his weight slightly lower, draw his paws in tighter, and stare at whoever was looking with amber eyes that communicated, with extraordinary clarity, that the visit was over. People didn't stay. They moved on. And Oliver was left alone again with whatever it was he was keeping. The question was one that no one had yet taken the time to answer. Why wouldn't he leave it, even for a second? The routine was so consistent, it had become almost invisible to the staff. Every morning, when the kennel technicians arrived to fill the food bowls, Oliver would eat but only a little, 4 or 5 bites at most before returning to his position. The dry food in his dish went largely untouched through the day, and while the staff noted it on their charts as poor appetite, no one connected it to anything deeper than stress. Shelter cats often refused to eat. The noise, the smells, the constant rotation of strangers, it wore on animals, the same way it wore on people. Poor appetite was common. It wasn't alarming. It was just Oliver being Oliver. He ignored the toys entirely. The small felt mouse that had been placed in his cage on intake day sat in the corner closest to the door, untouched for so long that the feathers glued to its tail had begun to curl with age. A crinkle ball had been tossed in during one well-meaning enrichment round and rolled to a stop near his water bowl, where it remained. Oliver had never batted it once. He didn't play. He didn't explore. He didn't perform the small, hopeful theater of approachability that shelter cats sometimes learned because they understood, on some instinctive level, that it increased their chances. He had no interest in increasing his chances. He had one interest, and it lived under his body. The nighttime camera footage, reviewed occasionally by the shelter's behavioral coordinator, Marcus, showed something that gave him pause. During the day, Oliver stayed awake and alert whenever the kennel was occupied. But at night, when the building emptied and the overhead lights clicked off row by row, something changed. Oliver would shift slowly, carefully, like he was trying not to disturb whatever lay beneath him and draw the object closer. Not carry it, exactly. More like pull it, nudge it with his chin. Then he would wrap himself around it in a tighter curve, a smaller perimeter, a more deliberate shelter. He never slept deeply. The footage showed his ears moving even in the darkest frames, rotating toward distant sounds, a car outside, the hum of the heating system, the settling of the building. He would lift his head, scan the emptiness of the kennel room, and lie back down. Head always positioned toward the front of the cage, body always curved around the thing he was keeping. Marcus watched that footage twice and said nothing to anyone. He wrote, "Hypervigilant, possible trauma history" in his notes, and closed the tab. The shelter was at 91% capacity. There were animals with more immediate problems that needed his attention. Oliver had been managing on his own for 6 weeks. He would manage a little longer, but the question quietly grew. What was it, exactly, that he was protecting so carefully he couldn't close his eyes all the way? Her name was Dana Whitfield, and she was 26 years old and had been volunteering at Hartwell for exactly 11 days when she first stopped at cage 14. She hadn't been warned away, not directly. The shelter's orientation materials mentioned that some animals required more patience than others, and one of the senior volunteers had said, offhandedly, that the gray tabby in the middle row was not really an adoption candidate right now. Dana had nodded and moved on, but she remembered the phrase, and, on her 3rd weekend shift, when she found herself with 40 minutes and no assigned task, she walked to the middle row and sat down on the floor in front of cage 14. She didn't reach toward the latch. She didn't even put her fingers through the mesh. She just sat. Oliver watched her from his corner. His ears were flat, his tail was tucked. His posture broadcast every familiar signal back off. This is mine. You're too close. And Dana observed all of it with the patient, analytical attention of someone who had grown up watching animals and knew the difference between what behavior looked like on the surface and what it meant underneath. He wasn't bracing to attack. His pupils weren't dilated into full black circles. His claws hadn't come out. What Dana saw wasn't aggression. It was the specific body language of an animal that expected something to be taken away from it and had long since given up on asking nicely. She came back the next day, and the day after that. She talked to him in a low, steady voice. Not baby talk. Not the coaxing, high-pitched sounds people often used with cats. She just talked about ordinary things. About the weather outside, about the drive over, about nothing in particular. The kind of talking you do when you want someone to know you're present but you're not making any demands. Oliver didn't respond. He didn't purr, didn't blink slowly, didn't do any of the things that cats did in videos where they were described as bonding with someone, but he also didn't look away. On the 5th day, Dana sat down in front of cage 14 and noticed something she hadn't before. Oliver had shifted his position slightly. Not much, a few inches maybe, but the shift had moved him fractionally closer to the front of the cage. She sat very still and let the silence hold. Then, for the first time since she had begun visiting, Oliver did not raise his voice when she was near. It happened on a Thursday morning, during the weekly deep clean. Dana had been assigned to assist with the middle row, which meant briefly transferring each cat to a holding carrier while the kennel technician wiped down the cage surfaces and refreshed the bedding. Most of the cats tolerated it with varying degrees of protest. When they reached cage 14, Dana was the one who opened the door, and Oliver immediately pressed himself into the corner, lowering his center of gravity, making himself as immovable as possible. The technician, a young man named Brett, reached for the holding carrier. "He's going to be a project," he muttered. Dana crouched low. She moved slowly. She spoke in the same even, unhurried voice she had been using for 5 days, and Oliver tracked her with those amber eyes, still wary, still braced. But as she eased her hand slightly closer, she caught a glimpse of what was beneath him, a strip of fabric. Gray or blue, hard to tell in the kennel light. It was clearly soft, the kind of soft that came from being washed and worn and handled over a long span of years. One frayed edge was visible, and something small seemed to be folded inside it, though Dana couldn't see what. Before she could register anything more, Oliver let out a sharp, escalating sound, not quite a hiss, not quite a yowl, and pressed down harder. Brett took a step back. "Yeah," he said, "there it is." Dana didn't move. She kept her voice steady and her eyes soft, and she stayed exactly where she was until Oliver's breathing slowed again. Then she withdrew and they cleaned the cage as best they could while he remained inside, which was not standard procedure, but was the only procedure that seemed to be available. Later, sitting in the volunteer break room with a cup of cooling coffee, Dana turned the image over in her mind. The piece of fabric. The way Oliver had reacted not like an animal defending a prize, but like an animal terrified of losing something that couldn't be replaced. The difference was enormous. She had seen resource guarding in dogs. It looked like teeth. It looked like intent. What she had seen in Oliver's eyes was not intent. It was grief. Something had happened to that cat. Something that left a single piece of fabric as the only evidence it had ever occurred. She wanted to know what it was. The disagreement with the shelter's intake coordinator happened on a Friday afternoon, when Dana overheard a conversation in the hallway near the staff office. Hartwell had a protocol. Animals assessed as high stress and non-adoptable after 60 days of placement were reviewed by the behavioral team, and if no improvement was documented, they were moved to one of two categories: extended foster, or, in cases where medical and behavioral costs outweighed available resources, they were considered for euthanasia. Oliver had been at Hartwell for 49 days. The 60-day mark was approaching. The intake coordinator, a woman named Rhonda, who managed the shelter's capacity with the practical efficiency that the job demanded, had made a suggestion. The object Oliver was guarding, whatever it was the source of his behavioral escalation. Remove it, she argued. Allow the animal to adapt to the environment without the stressor, and he might become accessible, adoptable, or at least more clearly evaluated. Dana stood in the doorway of the office and said, quietly but without hesitation, that she disagreed. The argument that followed was not dramatic. It was the kind of disagreement that happens in places where everyone is underfunded and overworked and genuinely trying to do the right thing, which means it was complicated and uncomfortable and didn't resolve cleanly. Dana's argument was behavioral. Oliver had never made contact with anyone, had never broken skin, had never done anything other than voice his distress. Every escalation had been defensive, not offensive. Whatever that object was, removing it without understanding its function, first was more likely to destabilize him than the object itself. Rhonda's argument was logistical. A shelter is not a therapy center. There were cats in other cages with straightforward adoption profiles who were not getting the attention they deserved because Oliver's kennel required twice the management time. The math was not heartless. It was honest. The outcome was a compromise. Dana was given 2 weeks to document a measurable behavioral change. If Oliver showed no progress toward adoptability within that window, the review board would move forward with their assessment. 2 weeks. 14 days. Dana drove home that evening with the specific, pressurized focus of someone who understood that time was now a factor, and that what she was looking for might not exist. But she didn't think that. She thought it did exist. She just hadn't found it yet. She started with Oliver's intake file. The document was thin. He had come to Hartwell as part of a municipal collection, what shelter staff called a property seizure intake, meaning he had been removed from a residential address by animal control following a housing-related emergency. The precise nature of the emergency was described in the file with the kind of terse bureaucratic language that stripped human context entirely. Occupant unable to maintain residence. Multiple animals collected. No owner contact established. There was a date, 11 weeks earlier, and an address in the north part of the city, and nothing else. No owner name. No contact number. No notation about the animal's history, its temperament, its medical background. Just a microchip number, a rabies vaccination record, and the entry date photograph, a gray tabby in a wire transport cage, ears flat, body low, looking at the camera with an expression that even in a 2-inch photo was readable as exhausted. Not feral, not aggressive, exhausted. Dana noticed something in the file that had been left unremarked. The line for items surrendered with animal was blank. Standard protocol required that any belongings accompanying an animal, toys, bedding, a carrier be documented. The line was blank, which meant either nothing had come with Oliver or the line had never been filled out. She kept reading. She found no behavioral notes from before intake, no indication that the animal had ever been assessed for the guarding behavior that had defined his entire stay. As far as the official record was concerned, Oliver had simply arrived already broken, with no explanation offered. But there was one more thing, a small notation at the bottom of the second page, added by hand in a different pen than the rest of the document. It read, C-Day, 2 welfare notes. Dana turned to the welfare notes. The day, 2 entry was missing. There was a gap in the paperwork. Someone had removed a page, or it had been misfiled, or it had simply fallen out in the way that paper sometimes did in a shelter that processed hundreds of intakes each year. The gap might mean nothing, but it was there, and it was the only anomaly in an otherwise featureless file. Dana made a note of it, closed the folder, and began to work backward from that missing day. The night shift log for Oliver's first week was stored in a binder in the utility room, which was not where night shift logs were supposed to be stored, but was where they had ended up because the shelving in the main office had been reorganized 6 weeks prior, and the older binders had been relocated without much system. Dana found it on a Tuesday morning, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the utility room, with binders spread around her like an unassembled archive. She found the week of Oliver's intake and went through it day by day. The camera still image attached to the Day 1 log showed Oliver in his cage without the object. He was pressed into the corner, but his body position was different from everything Dana had observed in the weeks following, less deliberate, more crumpled, like a cat that had been placed somewhere strange and hadn't yet decided how to manage it. The object was not visible anywhere in the frame. The Day 2 image showed it. It was under him already by the second morning. The same low, deliberate crouch, the same weight distributed to protect what lay beneath. Whatever that object was, Oliver had not arrived with it in his body. He had acquired it sometime in the first 24 hours of his stay, which meant someone had given it to him. Dana took the binder to Marcus and showed him the images side by side. Marcus looked at them for a long time. "I didn't work that day," he said. "Let me find out who did." The person who had worked the overnight intake on Oliver's second night was a part-time employee named Grace, who had since moved on to another facility and was reached by phone 3 days later. Grace remembered the gray tabby because she remembered most animals from that period, the way people remembered specific weeks that felt heavier than others. She remembered that a bag had been dropped off at the shelter's after-hours donation box the morning after Oliver arrived, a small paper bag, folded at the top. Inside the bag was a piece of fabric. There had been a note folded around it. Grace hadn't read the note carefully. She had assumed it was standard donation documentation. She had placed the bag through the kennel slot, in the general direction of the nearest cat, which happened to be Oliver. The bag itself was gone, but what was in it? The fabric. The note Oliver had been carrying ever since. The morning Dana finally got close to Oliver was the 38th day of her time at Hartwell. She had not rushed it. She had come every day, sat on the floor, talked about nothing. She had let him set every condition. And on that particular morning, she came in early, before the other volunteers arrived, when the kennel room was quiet and the overhead lights had just come on, and the whole building still had the particular stillness of a space that hadn't been asked to perform yet. Oliver was awake. He was always awake. But something in his posture that morning was fractionally different, not relaxed, not open, but not at full alert either. He looked at Dana when she sat down and didn't lower himself into the guard position. He just looked at her. She didn't speak right away. She waited. And then, very slowly, Oliver moved. He didn't come to her. He shifted his weight and adjusted his body and, for the first time in 38 days, the thing beneath him became visible. Dana held her breath. It was a piece of shirt, that much was clear now. A soft, washed-out blue, the cotton kind that had been laundered so many times the weave had gone almost feather-light. It had been folded, deliberately, around something small. And as Oliver settled back and looked at her with those amber eyes, Dana could see the edge of a piece of paper protruding from one fold. She didn't reach for it. She waited. Oliver watched her for a long moment. Then he looked down at the fabric. Then back at her. Dana leaned slightly forward, moving with the slowness of someone diffusing rather than approaching. And Oliver, for the first and only time since his arrival at Hartwell, did not flinch away. He stayed where he was and let her look. The note was small and had been handled many times. Its creases were deep, the paper soft at the folds from moisture and pressure. Dana could read only part of it from where she sat, and she didn't try to take it. But what she could see, a few lines in a cramped, hurried hand told her enough. The handwriting said, "Asterisk. I'm sorry I couldn't keep you. This is mine. It still smells like me. I hope it helps. Asterisk." Dana sat back on her heels and didn't try to speak. The fabric was a shirt. The note was a goodbye. The person who had left them, whoever they were, whatever had happened to them, had stood at an after-hours donation box in the dark and made the one gesture they had left to make. They had wrapped their scent in cotton and sent it through a slot in a wall. Oliver had found it. He had understood it in whatever way that cats understand things, not through language, not through reasoning, but through the oldest, most unambiguous sense he had. It smelled like the person who was gone. And so he had gathered it close and decided, with a clarity and a stubbornness that everyone at the shelter had called a behavioral problem, that he would not let it go. He had not been guarding a resource. He had been keeping a promise. The change in how the Hartwell staff saw Oliver did not happen all at once. It happened the way understanding usually happens in places where people are busy and overwhelmed, slowly, then suddenly, and with a particular quality of quiet shame that nobody named aloud. Marcus was the first. He reviewed Dana's documentation of the intake gap, looked at the camera images side by side, and sat for a long time with his hands folded on the desk. When he looked up, he said, "We were calling the symptom the problem." He pulled Oliver's behavioral file and removed the red ink notation. Brett, the kennel technician who had stepped back from cage 14 more than once, asked Dana one morning if she could show him what she'd been doing when she sat on the floor in front of the cage. She did, and he tried it, and Oliver looked at him with the same amber watchfulness, but did not escalate. Brett sat there for 20 minutes and said nothing. When he stood up, he didn't say anything about that either. He just went back to his route, but his pace near cage 14 was different after that. Quieter, more deliberate. Rhonda, for her part, moved Oliver off the review list without comment, which was perhaps the most meaningful gesture available to someone in her position. What had shifted was not policy or procedure. What had shifted was simpler and harder to document. People had stopped looking at Oliver and seeing what was inconvenient about him, and had started looking at him and seeing what had happened to him. The cat in cage 14 was not a difficult animal. He was an animal that had loved someone, lost them, and received a single piece of cloth as the last evidence that the love had been real. He had done the only thing he knew how to do with that evidence. He had held on, and if that looked, from the outside, like a problem, if the depth of what he was protecting had been misread as the danger of an animal too damaged to reach, then the failure belonged entirely to the people who had been too busy, or too tired, or too certain, to stop and ask what he was actually afraid of losing. Dana made no speech about it. She went back to sitting on the floor in front of cage 14 and kept talking about nothing in particular. She had 2 weeks, and she intended to use every day. The healing was not fast, and it was not linear, and it did not announce itself. It started with food. On the 4th day after the morning Oliver had let Dana look, he finished his entire bowl for the first time since his arrival. Dana noticed, recorded it, said nothing about it to Oliver so as not to make it strange. The next day, he finished the bowl again. The day after that, he moved slightly away from the guarded corner to eat, leaving the fabric in place behind him, not abandoning it, just allowing himself to exist at a small distance from it for the length of a meal. Dana began bringing different enrichment items. Not toys with feathers, not crinkle balls, a folded piece of fleece, a low, small box, a piece of paper bag to step on, things that didn't demand interaction, things that just offered options. Oliver investigated them in his own time, at night mostly, when the kennel cameras showed him moving with more curiosity and less vigilance than he had in all the weeks prior. He still carried the fabric to every new position. He still tucked it in against his body each time he settled. But the urgency had changed. It was less desperate now, the way the carrying of something beloved becomes less frantic once a person is reasonably sure it won't be taken. The family came in on a Saturday in late autumn, about 3 weeks after the morning with the note. A couple in their early 40s, a daughter about 12, who had been to the shelter twice before without finding a match. They had heard about Oliver in the way that news travels in small communities, not through any formal announcement, but through the particular information network of people who pay attention to animals and talk to one another about the ones that matter. They stood outside cage 14, and the father crouched down and looked in. Oliver looked back. He was not in the corner. He was near the center of the cage, and the piece of fabric was beneath his front paws, present but not crushed under his full weight. The daughter asked, "What's that he's holding?" Dana, standing behind them, gave the simplest version of the truth. "It's something that belongs to him. He's been taking care of it." The girl looked at the cat for a long time. "Is he going to be okay?" Dana said she thought so. She thought he already was, mostly. The family submitted an adoption application that afternoon. In the space where it asked about special needs, the mother wrote, "He keeps a piece of fabric. We'll make sure it comes with him." The house was quieter than the shelter, which Oliver needed, and smaller, which he seemed to prefer. He spent the first 3 days in the space beneath the bed in the daughter's room, whose name was Lily, and during those 3 days, the fabric was always with him. Lily would lie on her stomach at the edge of the bed and talk to him in the same kind of aimless, pressureless way that Dana had talked, which she hadn't been taught to do but arrived at naturally, and which worked for the same reasons it had always worked. On the 4th day, he came out. He moved through the house with the careful attention of an animal mapping new terrain, and the fabric moved with him, held loosely in his mouth as he went from room to room. He placed it near his food bowl the first evening. He slept beside it on the small bed that had been set up near the window in the living room. Over the weeks that followed, the relationship between Oliver and what he carried changed in ways that were visible to anyone paying attention. He still kept the fabric close. He still located it when he woke, but he no longer slept on top of it. He no longer organized his entire body around its protection. Sometimes it was on the cushion beside him. Sometimes it had been nudged to the foot of the bed, still within reach, still accounted for, but no longer requiring his constant supervision. He began, tentatively, and then more freely, to be a cat. He watched the birds outside the window. He accepted being brushed. He learned that Lily would come home from school at a particular time each day, and that her arrival could be anticipated from the sound of the front gate, and he began to be at the door when she came in, not every time, but often enough that she noticed and said once, to her mother, "I think he actually likes me." Her mother said she thought so too. He never stopped returning to the fabric. Once a day, sometimes more, he would go to wherever it had settled, put his nose against it, and stay for a few moments before moving on. Nobody in the family tried to move it or wash it or tuck it somewhere out of sight. It lived on the windowsill eventually, the same window where Oliver liked to lie in the afternoon light. And it stayed there the way that certain small objects stay in houses, not decorative, not purposeful in any conventional sense, but present and understood by everyone who lived there to belong. There was an evening in January, 3 months after his arrival, when the family was sitting in the living room after dinner, and Oliver was on the sill in the last of the winter light. The fabric was there, as it always was. Oliver was not lying on it. He was lying beside it, looking out at the street with the particular, self-contained calm of an animal that has decided it is safe to rest. He was not holding the shirt anymore. He was just near it. There was a difference, and everyone in the room understood it without saying anything. The thing he had protected in the dark of a shelter kennel for 11 weeks, that he had been misread and avoided and nearly lost everything for guarding it, had not become nothing to him. It would never be nothing. But it had shifted from a last resort to a keepsake. From the thing a person clings to when they are afraid of vanishing to the thing a person keeps because it is part of the story of how they got where they are. Oliver turned from the window, blinked once at the room in general, and climbed down to the cushion below where Lily was reading. He stepped over her feet and curled up against her leg and closed his eyes. Not all the way, not right away, but within a few minutes, his breathing evened out and his ears stopped tracking the sounds of the house, and he was, for the first time, in a very long while, simply asleep. The fabric on the windowsill caught the last of the evening light. It was not a dramatic thing to look at. A small square of faded blue cotton, worn to the texture of something that had been loved for years. There was nothing remarkable about it except its history, except the hands it had passed through, the slot it had come through in the dark, the weeks and weeks it had spent pressed beneath a gray tabby, who refused to let anyone take the last piece of evidence that someone, somewhere, had loved him enough to say goodbye. It was not the ending of a story. It was the place where one ended and another one quietly began. Outside, the street was lit and cold and ordinary. Inside, the room was warm. Oliver slept. The fabric remained where it was, holding its place on the sill, no longer something to survive with, not anymore, just something to remember. End of script. Asterisk approximate word count. 4,480 words. Asterisk.